Hi everyone. In this video, I want to explain a little bit more about monetary policy. Watch my previous videos where I explain what the monetary policy is. I explain different types of monetary policy. Here, I'm going to draw the graphs for expansionary monetary policy. And of course, you can think about the opposite case where we try actually to deal with inflation, and the Federal Reserve as the central bank in United States tries to implement the restrictive or tight monetary policy. So the goal here for the Federal Reserve, since it's about monetary policy, remember it's all about the Federal Reserve as a central bank. So the Federal Reserve's goal here is to increase the aggregate demand because the Federal Reserve is concerned about recession. Again, you can think about the times that we're dealing with COVID-19 outbreak. The economy is slow. So the Federal Reserve can also help us to kind of recover and recover from the recession and kind of boost the economy. So the Federal Reserve cannot really change the aggregate demand directly, but the Federal Reserve can control the money market. So by changing few things in the money market, the Federal Reserve can change the aggregate demand, okay? So I'm going to start with looking at the money market, and then we're going to draw also aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and see how the money market is connected to aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So this is my money market. So here I have the quantity of money, I have the interest rate. In the previous chapters we talked about money market, so if you don't remember demand for money or demand or supply for money, definitely watch that video and review the money market. So this is our downward slope money demand, and hopefully we remember that money supply is vertical because the Federal Reserve is in charge of controlling the supply of money. So I'm going to call this supply of money MS1. So the market equilibrium is right here. So this is our I star 1, and then this is our QM1. So the Federal Reserve controls this market completely, and the Federal Reserve can change things in the money market and then in kind of directly change the aggregate demand, okay? So the best thing for the Federal Reserve to do during recession times is to reduce the interest rate. Why? Because remember that one of the important components we have in aggregate demand is investment, right? We have investment, and also we have C, consumption expenditures, which is how much the individuals spend, right? So if the Federal Reserve reduces, so the Federal Reserve goal here is to reduce the interest rate. I'm kind of moving backwards. So the Federal Reserve will want to reduce the interest rate because as soon as the interest rate goes down, remember that the interest rate is the opportunity cost of borrowing. So it means that the Federal Reserve is making borrowing cheap for everybody in a hope that the investors will borrow more money and they will spend it in the economy, invest more in the economy. Also, when the interest rate is low, the Federal Reserve is kind of encouraging people to borrow money, to spend more money, buy a house, buy a new car, get a college loan, or get a personal loan and spend it. So these are the ways that the Federal Reserve can actually change the aggregate demand here, okay? So the goal here for the Fed is to reduce the interest rate. If the interest rate goes down, investment will go up, consumption expenditures will go up. But the question is how the Federal Reserve can change the interest rate. And the answer goes back to the money market. We remember from the money market discussion we had that there is an inverse relationship between the supply of money and the interest rate. So if the Federal Reserve want to reduce the interest rate, So the Federal Reserve should actually increase the supply of money. That's the key. That's the thing that the Federal Reserve will do in the money market. So the Federal Reserve is going basically to inject more money in the market, okay? Provide more money for everybody. But there is a cost here. Let me show you. So the Federal Reserve will increase the supply of money. So there will be a rightward shift in our MS, our money supply. So the location of MD is the same. Remember, MD is coming from us, individuals. It's not going to change. The Federal Reserve is injecting more money. So the supply of money is higher than before. And look, it was equilibrium. This was our equilibrium number 1. This is our equilibrium number 2. Look, at the new equilibrium, the interest rate went down. And of course, we have more money in the market. That was the goal. So the goal was to reduce the interest rate, and interest rate went down as soon as the Federal Reserve increased the supply of money. Okay, so now the interest rate is lower. We're going back here. So people are going to spend more money. Investors are going to borrow more money. They're going to invest more. So these two together will increase the aggregate demand, which was again our goal down here, right? So aggregate demand will go up. So now let's look at the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So we have real GDP here, price level here, okay? So we had this upward slope aggregate supply and downward slope aggregate demand. Remember, we are talking about expansionary monetary policy because we had a recession here, okay? So our aggregate demand right now is low. We have recessionary gap. There is a gap between potential GDP and the actual GDP here, which is GDP, real GDP number 1. And if you recall the aggregate from previous discussions we had, aggregate demand cannot go up overnight. There are some small changes in aggregate demand because of the multiplier effect. So the aggregate demand will go up step by step eventually, okay? So our aggregate demand, because of more spending and more investment in the economy, will go up. So there will be a rightward shift in aggregate demand. This would be 82, or it's basically 81 plus minor change in aggregate demand. And we have at the new equilibrium, we have more money for everybody to spend. So this is our new real GDP, more income. People are going to spend more. Again, they're going to invest more in the economy. So one more time, our aggregate demand will shift to the right. So this part is very, very similar to fiscal policy that we discussed. So this would be our new aggregate demand. And let's say at this equilibrium, real GDP is the same as potential GDP. So we had this much gap again between our actual GDP and potential GDP. Now that the aggregate demand increased, we are back to full employment. We recovered basically from recession. I know that it's easy on the graph. It's not really an easy job in the real world, but that's the model, that's the concept behind all these actions that the Federal Reserve takes during recession times. It's super easy to draw a graph, but it's super hard to change the aggregate demand in real life. Just keep that in mind for both fiscal policy and monetary policy. But that's the goal for the Federal Reserve. So basically, that's what the Federal Reserve is also doing during the recession times because of the COVID-19. So the Federal Reserve is reducing the interest rate. Right now, the interest rate is close to 0 because, again, the Federal Reserve wants to encourage us to keep spending money in the economy, because we remember from previous chapters that C is the biggest component in our GDP. And GDP is nothing but the income for our country. So the Federal Reserve is keeping the interest rate low, it's close to zero, because the Federal Reserve wants us to spend more money, to use our credit cards, to get a loan, to, if you are an investor, get a loan, invest it, do something, spend your money in the economy. Okay, but how fast this aggregate demand will go up, we really don't know, because it's really depend on the level of kind of recession and how deep we are into the recession. But that's the idea behind the expansionary fiscal policy. So keep in mind that expansionary fiscal policy, monetary policy is when the Federal Reserve wants to deal with recession. And if the Federal Reserve wants to deal with inflation, then there will be a restrictive monetary policy. And the goal here will be to reduce the aggregate demand, because the economy is just too big and the Federal Reserve wants to decrease the aggregate demand. This time, the Federal Reserve will reduce the supply of money. He wants basically people stop spending money because we have inflation. So the consumption expenditures and investments will go down as soon as the Federal Reserve increases the interest rate by reducing the supply of money. So try also to look at the graphs and redraw everything for restrictive monetary policy. One thing that I want you to pay attention is, and as I mentioned when I was drawing kind of this graph and moving on to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply, the supply of money is going up, so the interest rate is going down. So everything is doing kind of perfect here, because we want to boost the economy. We want people to spend more money, but there is a cost here for us. Look at the graph here. As soon as the aggregate demand increases and we are at full employment, look at the price. Look at the price level. We were able to deal with this recessionary gap here. We were able to deal with recession, but there is a cost here. The cost is having higher price level, inflation, right? So there's always a trade-off. So you want to have a better economy, you want to recover from recession, but here's the cost. Everything will be more expensive. However, the Federal Reserve in the United States has its own way of also controlling the price. So the Federal Reserve doesn't really allow the prices to change that much. The Federal Reserve has some sort of a goal for inflation. So the Fed doesn't allow the inflation rate to go beyond 2% or 2.2%, and tries to basically tight the prices around this inflation rate. But during a deep kind of recession, or I don't want to use the term depression, but even during like depression times, the Federal Reserve might not be able to control much of the inflation rate. Just keep that in mind. And another point is for you guys to keep in mind is this is happening in the short run, less than 6 months. In the long run, keeping the interest rate low is not a good idea, because according to many economic models, when the interest rate is low for a long time, you cannot really control this inflation rate. You cannot really control this price, and the impact on the price level will be significant. We will end up sometimes with 2-digit inflation rate. So we have to be very careful with how long we're reducing the interest rate and keeping the interest rate low, and how effective it is. So during the time that we have deep recession, the Federal Reserve and the government work together to kind of increase this aggregate demand and deal with recession, because the Federal Reserve by itself is not that powerful to change things in the economy. Same thing with government. Government also needs the help of the Federal Reserve. So basically, during recession times, we have expansionary fiscal policy along with monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy, because they can work together better, and it's like two people are helping a car to move forward, to push it. So Federal Reserve and government together actually can kind of help us to recover from recession. Okay, so take a look at the graphs, and I hope that you find this video helpful.